Tim, welcome. Tim Baker, welcome to the third episode of David Anderson talking market data. And as I can see behind you, we're on air now as we speak.
On air, yes. My team have just turned the light on for me. Thanks, guys.
I know. Well, my team are sort of hovering in the background. They'll turn the lighting up a bit. And Soundman, can you adjust the sound, please? A little. I wish. You know, one man bands and whatever. But that's the joys of podcasting. Tim, thank you for agreeing to do that. It's much appreciated. We're going to talk about a few topics, 3 topics later on today in this podcast. But let me kick off by. I know you really well. When we were offline, I was trying to remember when we first met at an FISD event in Paris 10 plus years ago. You know, you were in your school shorts at the time, of course.
Along with you, David.
Of course, I wish. But can you give us a brief sort of history of Tim Baker's illustrious career? Yeah. I suppose we could touch upon Rolls-Royce apprenticeships, seeing as my father worked in Derby at Rolls-Royce as well, but not as relevant for the market data audience.
Well, I guess the only thing I would say about that is I was a telemetry analyst, and that was all about data. It was all about data coming off jet engines, and the computers could barely write the data fast enough to a drive. So I guess when I came back I got back into technology 20 odd years later, 30 years later, I was pretty kind of still a data geek. But no, I got out of engineering fairly soon after graduating. I did a sandwich course and ended up at Rolls-Royce. It was terrific. But moved into their finance team. In treasury management, so I was managing the risk of the company, financial risk of the company. I was
probably trying to sell you Telerate. I remember going to the Rolls-Royce treasury team, trying to sell Telerate.
That might be when we first met. That might be because we definitely had Telerate, the green screen. Yeah. I was responsible. We were all engineers doing kind of financial hedging instruments. And we all had responsibilities for the tech. So I did the telephone system and the market data stuff. So, and I also used to write things for the Confirm system, which was very basic.
We digress slightly, but I remember when I was selling to these corporate treasuries all over the Midlands, I had to have an acoustic coupler to do the trial. You know, I can't remember what the board rate of that was.
There you go. Yeah.
You know, that was the only way, you could get a trial of your Telerate was through an acoustic coupler. But let's jump forward.
Anyway,
when did you first
so I ended up back in financial services when I moved to Mexico. My wife had been posted there by BP, joined her, and ended up being hired by a stockbroker, a Mexican stockbroker. It was just after NAFTA. So it was a great experience in our lives. We were there for 7 years and ended up being hired while I was still there by Swiss Bank Corporation, which became part of UBS.
Yeah, SBC, I remember them.
And ended up running Latin American research and then moved to the States and was deputy head of research in the US. So managing analysts and doing stock research, but showed an unhealthy interest in a couple of things. One was the data that we were generating. So we were building data products. And then latterly, I was helping invest in fintechs with the bank's capital. That was pre-financial crisis, and when that happened in 2008, all of that got shut down, which was a shame. But I had another kind of set of tools in my tool bag, and then ended up at Thomson Reuters. And stayed there for about 10 years. That was 2010. And was doing what they call content strategy. So I had a team of about 120 people, I think, who were
that's when you presented in Paris.
That's right.
It would have been around about that sort of time. Yeah.
And that broadened my experience in terms of just the breadth. I mean, the great thing about TR was the breadth and depth of data that they had. So I was on another kind of steep learning curve, which I loved being on. And then had a variety of kind of leadership roles. I ran partnerships for a while, worked very closely with Deb Walton, um, and Brennan, who we were both good friends with. Um, and latterly, was doing innovation, running an innovation team, and built out Refinitiv Labs, and that became LSEG Labs, and that really got me into data science and AI, and not large language models as they were called then, but we were definitely dabbling in that space. I left Refinitiv, as it was still called, at the end of 2019, before it became properly LSEG, and joined IEX. So IEX, if you know Flash
Yeah.
Boys, the book Flash Boys by Michael Lewis, they're the group that built a kind of challenger stock exchange in the
Yeah.
US, and they've been dabbling in market data and building out a data platform, and I ran that for about 18 months, and grew the business, and that was during COVID, so it was a weird time to join a new company. We hired people, we scaled up, we switched data providers. I left there and then started consulting. And one of the firms that I'd hired while I was at IEX to do some work for me was consulting with them. And that was a company called Expiro, and joined them full time about 2 years ago. And then, as you know, more recently, IEX decided to sell that data business, or sell the assets. And that's what me and a couple of other guys decided to buy about 3 months ago.
Hold that thought, because that's going to be one of the three topics. Oh, blue sky thinking. There's your mug.
That's my consulting business.
Exactly. So we're going to talk about three topics. It's the way I'm approaching this podcast, to have sort of each
Yeah.
guest talk about three topics. Well, I may have a pause between each one, because I may choose to edit them into smaller chunks. I'm still, in fact, anybody who's watching this podcast, if you're watching the longer version and wish that I had chopped it up, tell me in the comments, because I'm trying to work out whether people like shorter sections or longer sections. I will learn. We will learn together.
And by the
So
way,
that,
David, I
yeah,
have to say, hats off to you for having a go at this. I think it's brilliant because you're so knowledgeable and you've got so much to give back to the community, and this is just a terrific way of doing it and staying
I
in contact with people too. So hats
well,
off to you.
don't tell my wife, because this is part of my semi-retirement, and it's the bit that, strictly speaking, is the retirement bit. But this is me. I enjoy doing this. I
It's
enjoy,
called they call it career transition these days.
well, and I enjoy.
Yeah.
People have said that David Anderson likes the sound of his own voice. Don't know where they get that idea from, but that's one of the reasons I'm doing it. So, three topics that you and I are going to talk about on this section. We might dive deep into them in future episodes. First one gives you a bit of an opportunity to do a sales pitch and explain your new venture, but really deeper than that, trying to understand where it fits in the sort of macro market data world, etc., the financial capital markets. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about. The second thing that you and I often talk about, and that was on a previous episode that I did with Brennan Carley, who I think was my first episode, and he and I talked about AI. But I want to pick your brains. I still think this is a topic that not everybody understands that well, and frankly, we all need to understand it better. So I'm going to seek your help to try and get a better understanding in the context of market data. And then the final topic, which I have seen you being a little bit vocal on, is the whole issue of identifiers,
Hmm.
and a couple of things that I think you've mentioned occasionally about CUSIP and their role. So we'll talk about that. It's a little bit more contentious, so
That'll
we'll
keep
save
people
that.
on till the end, won't it?
Yeah,
That's
we'll
that's the
leave that
teaser.
to the end bit. So three sections that we're going to talk. Let us kick off. So as you alluded to, you have just created Blue Sky Nexus. I think is the
Yes,
sort
that's
of
the current name.
yeah. So I mean, I suppose explain what it is, but
Yeah.
explain why anybody should be interested. Where does this new concept that you've created? What is the gap that you're filling? What's
Yeah.
the point of it? Describe in the wider ecosystem of the big market data. You've got the big data vendors, the mega ones like now LSEG used to be Refinitiv, Bloomberg, etc. FactSet. As you've got the big exchanges, you've got smaller. I mean, where does this fit, and why is there a need for it?
Yeah. So let me kind of go back a little bit to I think the original idea behind IEX Cloud, which was the business that built the asset that we bought. And the vision there was very much around providing what we now call an easy button to build financial applications. And I think this was probably born out of the exchange's own experience, of needing to bring in data into their infrastructure and put it together and have a website and maybe have some charts and what have you. And I don't want to speak too much for IEX, but I think, very creative entrepreneurs, and they thought, hey, let's have a go at building a business to help other people do this. And I very much bought into that notion, having seen how difficult it is to buy data, particularly as a startup from the big incumbent firms, like LSEG and Bloomberg and FactSet and S&P.
So therefore, it's a different audience. It's not the bulge bracket banks who buy masses of data. You're targeting
So this was the
segment.
original. So certainly the original vision was to sell into actually a little bit of a mix, but certainly the fintech community became early adopters. People building new apps, but apps that needed market data, and of course IEX had. Has a very liberal licensing policy around real-time prices, for example. So, as you know,
liberal means what's
liberal
a
meaning
euphemism
you
for?
want to redistribute. So we could provide that data to a third party, and they wouldn't, and it was real-time, near real-time prices. So it's about 10 or 15 millisecond delayed, but quite good. And it could go onto a website, or it could be licensed out by third parties, and they wouldn't have to pay extra fees, and they wouldn't have to register all those users.
Redistribution agreement, which a
So
lot of exchanges have.
the redistribution was very reasonable, and that was of great interest, obviously, to third parties building apps, because that's a big extra cost and a burden in terms of the keeping track of whether you're a business or not non-business user, whether it's display or non-display. There's a lot of complexity in all of that. And maybe we'll come back to that complexity later. But actually, when I came back to the business and I saw the books, and I should say we didn't buy IEX Cloud, we bought the asset, so we bought the code.
Yeah.
But I was shown the names of some of the clients, and there were some asset managers in there. There were some hedge funds. So, over the course of the last couple of years, the platform was being discovered by more traditional buyers of data, especially things like end of day pricing, which you might need to backtest a model. This is all data that can take you weeks or months to negotiate access to. And yet the platform will allow you to literally go and find the data you want, pay for it on a credit card. You could have an invoice if you wanted, but you can pay on a credit card, and you're entitled, and you can pretty much use that data in whatever form you want.
So, because I remember when we had the pre-chat about this, I sort of said, "Oh, is it alternative data? Is it all these obscure data sets?" And you said, "No, it wasn't that." If I'm hearing you correctly, it's more making data that maybe the sophisticated bigger players get access through big sophisticated data vendors. But if you're a smaller or newer or a startup or whatever, or have a different commercial model, if you go through that traditional commercial and technical channel, it's problematic. So you've sort of created a different access methodology and commercial format for that different audience.
Yeah, so I think certainly if you're a startup, there's this notion of fail fast. It's very hard to fail fast if it takes you 6 months to get the data. The way that we're standing up the new business, you can get the data and a slice of the data very, very quickly and you can build something. Of course, building software is a lot easier than it used to be. So we're really the fuel behind a lot of those new ideas that are coming out and need to find a place in the market. But I think you're right. I think there's general frustration at the moment, and I've had a bunch of people approach me who are more traditional buyers of market data. Even a hedge fund came to me recently and said, "Look, I'm trying to, as a hedge fund, even though we make lots of money, we still have to, this notion of operational alpha. We have to manage our costs, and our market data costs have skyrocketed, and we generally only need end of day prices and a few other bits and pieces." And they were paying an awful lot of money, and they can look at us and go, actually, your price for the closing price of this security in Sydney is the same as someone else's price. It's come from the same source. And so I think we can be a little bit disruptive in that area. But I think the other thing we want to do is not so much be a marketplace for data, but really to help. With the concentration that's happened in the market and the big vendors, and when I was at Refinitiv, we already had an events data set, we already had a dividends data set, we already had fundamentals, we already had estimates. So if there was a new provider of one of those data sets doing a better job, or maybe with some interesting analytics, we would never buy that, or we would never redistribute that data because it would be competitive.
Yeah.
So I think there's a big barrier to entry for a lot of those, and that I don't see them as being alternative data companies. I think they're companies that are mining Edgar and collecting data and cleaning data and doing all of that, but finding that market, I think, is much harder.
But it's interesting your choice of the word concentration. I mean, there's a whole nother conversation to be had, and I've got question marks in my head. I've been in this industry 40 years, and I've seen the big customer firms. I mean, how many bulge bracket are there now? 11, 12, 10 maybe. They're constantly, with UBS and Credit Suisse coming together recently, that sort of took one out, and then the data vendors, the exchanges, they're all getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Mm.
But I think it's interesting that in essence, if I'm hearing you correctly, a lot of the data you might be selling, you sort of could get from one of these mega suppliers, and maybe it's more expensive, but maybe it's more expensive because it's wrapped up and packaged with a million other things that you don't want.
Yeah.
But here's a thing that I'm aware of when I talk to my friends on the customer side. They use this expression, the long tail, when you're in procurement. And I think
Yeah.
what they mean by that is you've got these mega, two or three suppliers who represent 50, 60% of what you buy. Bloomberg, frankly, and LSEG and a couple of others or whatever. And then you've got a middle tier. But then you've got this long tail of arguably teeny weeny specialist companies. And
Yeah.
that, and I think you're probably fitting into that category or whatever.
A
Or maybe
little
you're an
bit.
aggregate.
I mean, I think the first thing is a lot of the smaller firms don't have a sophisticated way of delivering data. So they've tended to develop those data sets in such a way they can be consumed by maybe the top 20 hedge funds, the most sophisticated hedge funds,
Yeah.
and they're delivered, as a bulk file every day, perhaps. What we have and what we acquired was a system that can take that bulk data and turn it into a very queryable high performance API. So the client doesn't have to onboard the data. They can just ask for the stuff that they want and they get that in real time. For the hedge funds, they don't care about that. In fact, they don't like that. The big hedge funds don't
I was
like that.
just about to pick up on that because the hedge funds probably not exactly don't like you, but they don't care. They want it messy and dirty because they can
The
cope
barrier.
with messy and dirty.
Yeah.
But there's this middle group somewhere, which must be your sweet spot,
Yeah.
who don't want it messy, but aren't as sophisticated as a Goldman Sachs or a Bank of America or a Citi.
Or
Somewhere in
maybe
that
they
middle.
just want to move more quickly. Maybe they actually know what they want. I mean, we've got a client right now who knows exactly what they want, and we can give it to them, and they hit the API, they get it, they can build their model, and they're off to the races. So I think speed and agility is a big piece of this. But for the data provider, it gives them access to that long tail. That their long tail is beyond those top 20 hedge funds. There's another
So there's a
few
long
hundred
tail of
firms.
customers. There's a
Yes.
long
And
tail of
they,
supply. Yeah,
yeah,
both.
and they don't have um, the e-commerce platform. They don't have the ability to permission a consumer to 100 tickers, for example. They just have to
Yeah.
give the whole lot away, and maybe a license, that they can't really enforce takes care of that. So this gives them a lot of control in terms of data delivery. So
Now,
this is still a hypothesis, David, but we
yeah.
see that there's a supply side component to this with especially the independent data providers, and there are tons of them, and some of them are very good. A lot of them are very good. And then there's the demand side, which is, firms just looking to, kind of not pay as much as they want to pay, or maybe they want to have a little bit more diversity, or maybe they prefer fundamentals from a niche content provider that has a better data set.
So in this middle area that you're targeting, you mentioned the word marketplaces. I've heard that phrase used a few years ago, and it was companies like Snowflake and Databricks. And I confess, I'm not sure I totally understand where all is that something different to what you're doing
I th-
from
I think I think it's different because I think with look, Snowflake and Databricks, they're great firms and they're huge and they make life easy for people that want to combine data from lots of different pools. But at the end of the day, particularly Snowflake is a data lake in the cloud. And with a data lake, but all data lakes, you still have to connect the data together. You still have to integrate it, and it needs to be permissioned as well. And when you put your data into Snowflake as a provider, you're forcing your clients to be Snowflake customers, and that brings with it some cost. There's a thing called the internet. The internet is very, very good at delivering data on demand. You think of the Amazon model right now. So Amazon absolutely has warehouses, right? I can get
yeah.
stuff same day delivery coming from a warehouse down the road. But the vast majority of stuff that I buy on Amazon is being delivered directly from source. It's being delivered from the provider's warehouse.
But
And that's
Amazon's a
kind of what
really
we're facilitating. We're facilitating a much more direct connection between data owner and data consumer. And
well,
there's no and by sorry, David, and by
uh,
having a set of standards and an API that's very easy to use, you don't have to store it. You just ask for it, and you can pay for it on demand if you want
do
to.
with your Snowflake analogy, but don't customers have to be a customer of Blue Sky Nexus? In a sense, aren't you also inserting yourself in there? And let me
Yeah,
throw another thought at you.
very
Two
true.
questions at one, just because you can cope with that, Tim. You've got broad shoulders. Your Amazon analogy was an interesting one. I think one criticism I've seen of Amazon is the fact that they have all this marketplace. They have all these third party providers. I've wondered about being one of those, my sort of passive income ideas or whatever, drop shipping and all that. There's loads
Yeah,
of. But one thing they do is if they have a third party vendor supplier and their customers really love it, and Amazon have the data so they can see that there's a great interest, then Amazon go and create their own branded, white labeled, whatever it is, product and compete against their internal vendor, and they've got all the strength and all the data to do it. So, I mean, if you're a small data provider and you put your data through Blue Sky Nexus or Snowflake or whatever, isn't there a risk if there's a lot of demand for that this middle person, Blue Sky or Snowflake or whatever, could somehow not steal your business? That's the wrong word, but
build their own data sets
yeah,
version. Look, I think there's that risk exists everywhere, and there are
yeah.
some of those big data vendors that do
I was
that. I
just
wouldn't I wouldn't
yeah,
include Snowflake and I wouldn't include Databricks because I think they're both very focused on the tech.
yeah.
I would say we're very focused on the tech. We're also very focused on making it easy for the onboarding of data and then the delivery of that data. So the API that we have is very easy to use. And everything's very, very self-documented. Now, right now, we're a CTO and 3 developers. So we're not building any new data sets. Now, that said, then there's definitely some core, what I consider core data that we already curate automatically.
And
Um,
are you doing a thing that a phrase when I was on the triarch side showing my agent, normalizing data? In
yes,
fact, look at your website, and there's a lot of information up there, and you're getting all this disparate data from lots of different providers, but you're putting some sort of standardized, normalized
yes.
structure to it, which makes it more accessible.
Yeah,
I
we do. Yeah, so we do a lot of that. So that's really at the core of the proposition, because if we don't do that, then the consumers would have to do that themselves, and they might as well go direct to source if they're going to do that. And that's a to build a system like the system that we have would cost probably tens of millions of dollars. It's a hard thing to do. So what we do is we take big pipes of data and we normalize that. We apply symbology. We'll talk about that a bit later. We have a way of modeling time. So the system understands what a millisecond is, but also what a quarter is and a year end. And all of those things play into the way the API works, so that when someone writes to the system or reads from the system through an API call, they're getting the data in a very clean format. So if they're asking for fundamental data, it will be tagged by quarter and month and year and period end. And if they ask for price data, they'll have it in a different format. And actually, they can ask for both at the same time, and we deliver a cube of data that they can very easily consume.
I think this is a good segue into the second topic, which we're going to talk about AI. And I remember you when we were putting together a panel at WIFIC on AI. You were
In
one
the
of the
early
advisors.
days,
Yeah, and you were saying a key element of the AI data should be ready. AI, was it ready?
already.
Yeah, because that was a key point. Just pouring unstructured, unready, unsanitized, whatever the right words are, data into AI. You could do something with AI, but actually doing some work on the data before it's fed into AI. Let me do one of my pauses, because I want to have a pause between we've moved off your baby Blue Sky Nexus, and then the second topic we're going to talk about is going to be AI. But here comes the pause. Are you ready for it? Here it comes. That was the pause. So if I need to edit it later, I've got a pause, because in my first podcast I just kept talking.
You've spoken after the pause. So do we have to do another pause now?
No, we're into the
We're
second
into the second
topic.
part.
So
Okay.
the second topic,
Are you going to have
which
ads between the pauses? That's the big
we
question.
may, there's all sorts of things we could have. And again, if you happen to be a listener, a watcher who missed the first part of this, you might want to go and listen to the first part to make sense of this part. But this is a standalone as well. But I think it was interesting what you were just talking about. Artificial intelligence, AI. We've all gone mad with generative AI. I suppose I want you to sort of set the scene a little bit on what you're seeing going on, what you think people who work in the market data industry, be they exchanges, data vendors, customers, technology, whatever, that whole community, what should they be taking note of? What should they be worrying about? What should they be learning about? And I guess that is a little bit of you can refer back to one of your topics that you mentioned to me, that having data that is ready to be fed in to AI is a good thing, or something
Yeah.
worthwhile working
Yeah.
on. I mean, let me shut up and you just educate
Well,
us a bit.
and who knows that my comments will probably be out of date in the next 6 weeks, the speed that
Yeah,
things are moving. But some things are still. I think we were right on that original AI panel we did in London. I think some of the use cases that we talked about them have played out now. So, for example, market data and data in particular is kind of hard to navigate. And you look at a Bloomberg or you look at any of these desktop products and you kind of look at them, they all look slightly different and they've been built up over 30 years. So one of the most common use cases, because large language models allow you to have a conversation with a computer, basically, having a large language model overlay on top of that terminal experience, or maybe allowing you to go behind the terminal and pull data in, is a very logical kind of use case. And I think I think Microsoft did a very big, I think they've been working with the Aladdin team over at BlackRock, and now Aladdin has an AI front end. If you look at some of the stuff that Morningstar is doing, and they're partners of ours with Expiro, they've come up with this AI called Mo, and Mo has a conversation with a financial advisor and helps them put together documents. So I think having an AI on top of an interface is a very logical thing to do. And frankly, if you don't do that, then everyone's going to expect it in the next 10 years that you can just talk to your interface instead of having to figure out what buttons to press.
But my first episode with Brennan Carley, we were talking about this. And again, I think that I'm sort of getting my head around the phrase large language models seems to suggest that it's the word language equates in my head to text-based information. And what we were just talking about, the sort of adding structure and or whatever, is that Brennan was saying, and I've heard this in other quarters as well, is that the very structured real-time pricing data that I grew up with, which was my early exposure to market data, arguably it lends itself less to AI than the realms of data, the vast reams of data that are text-based, research reports or whatever, that are quote unquote unstructured in their nature. Yes. I mean, are there some things that lend themselves to AI and other things less so?
Well, so AI is a very broad topic. Yeah. So outside of the text-based stuff, there are other pattern recognition solutions. Let's put it that way. So Google Images can look at an image and say, I think that's David Anderson, so I'm going to tag that photo as David Anderson. So, and let's face it, an image is a very complex thing to look at for a computer, but they've kind of nailed that. Time series data is all about patterns. Now, there are already very powerful models, multivariate time series analytics, that can look at trends and correlations. I wouldn't necessarily call that AI, but I think what I was going to move on to is there are emerging technologies that enable that conversation and the large language model to reference factual data. So, for example, when GPT first came out, I would ask it. I used to have various experiments, and I would show it a chart and say, "What's this thing?" And it would say, "It's a graph of something going up," or whatever. It was very basic, relatively basic. It might understand it was a stock chart. And then maybe 6 months later, I showed it an NVIDIA stock chart, and it had some trend lines on it, and it described exactly what it was. It could pull out data points. It could see that there was a peak. It told me what the maximum value of NVIDIA was and what date that was on. So it was analyzing. It wasn't looking at the underlying data, but it was really understanding that image. There are ways of modeling data. I used to be a bit of a kind of a geek around this. Around connected data can be expressed as a graph, a knowledge graph. So almost like a neural network. And in our industry and in market data, a knowledge graph might connect issuers with instruments, with regions, with, so a knowledge graph would describe those those hardwired things in the market, and your LLM based or chat based solution should be able to, or can access a hardwired knowledge graph so that it can have a point of reference. It understands, instead of using millions of documents on the internet to identify a possible relationship between these two companies, in that knowledge graph is the factual relationship between that company and its subsidiary. And so increasingly you're seeing these AI systems reference pools of knowledge and facts so that they are dialing back to a highly reliable. That's why the interface example is a good one, because if you're using AI to steer Bloomberg and it pulls up a chart, you know that chart coming from Bloomberg, it's not being hallucinated.
Yeah.
Um, and
So
and, and
is it?
there are other ways of augmenting the large language model with internal documents and internal databases. So you can bring your model in-house and then have it access to all of the knowledge of your firm. And I think that's a very powerful set of use cases that, big companies are
And I think
exploring.
that's the interesting thing to watch is how these use cases sort of evolve. And if I've understood some of what you're saying, I think I understand most of it, but some is perhaps beyond me. But it's like a combination of different AI techniques. You could say that the large language model, the generative AI thing that everybody's very aware of in our day-to-day lives, could be combined with other AI techniques, pattern recognition type techniques, and maybe, and I think again, my simplistic view, and one of the key things that is so exciting and appealing about this generative AI is that you can ask questions in a natural language format
Yes.
rather than have to be a database and understand SQL, structured query language, which was a lot harder. Now you can just ask it a question.
And those in the past applications were built with those SQL queries hardwired. Whereas now, I mean, at Expero, we're building AI systems where you ask a system a set of questions, and it will go away and join three data sets. It will then see that the result has geographic pointers in it, and it will go, oh, I'm going to put that on a map because that's map data. So you're creating a much more creative and powerful and unconstrained environment for the user, which I find incredibly exciting. I
And then you
think I
mentioned
think
hallucinations. Hallucinations is one of the
well,
the
that's why
fear
dialing
factor.
back to facts, so they're addressing that in a number of ways. One is dialing back to and referencing factual data, so a source of truth, and that's what many of the vendors they have that, and that's really what I was referencing. In that in London, was the AI needs to know where those facts are and how those facts are organized. And so to be AI ready, you need to document that data. You need to tell it, here's the metadata. Here's what this data is. Here's how to use it. Here's some standard fields like Symbology that can be used to join it with that other SQL data set. Here's a knowledge graph that will help you navigate from a list of companies to a list of securities, and then pull that data and assemble it. And I guess the other thing that we're seeing happen is much more specialized agents that are kind of hanging off those core models, which are specialized at doing certain things. And I think we talked about this as well in London. I probably mentioned Wolfram Alpha, which does really hard math. And
Yeah.
so, GPT will hand that problem to Wolfram Alpha, or maybe, OpenAI will build those specialized agents, or maybe
Is
firms will build specialized agents.
is what you were talking about a couple of minutes ago or whatever? Is that come under the umbrella title of explainability? I remember when I started looking at
Yes.
AI before if you get an answer, you then got to make sure that it's explainable. You understand how it got that answer. You shouldn't just take
We
the
call it
answer.
show your working. Show your working. The show your
Yeah.
working. How did you calculate that thing? And then there is take me to the source of truth for that data. And actually, what's now happening is other AIs are checking the working, right? So it's
Yeah.
like I've just done this thing. This AI model solution has built this thing, and then another model is checking it. I did a post about this a few weeks ago. I see AI as being a recipe, right? So for the use case, the specific use case you're looking at, you'll need a large language model. You might need some prompt engineering. You might need a RAG, which is one of these local databases. And then like any chef, it's a case of, okay, how do you mix all of that stuff together? I had a summer intern who was a high school grad, and he had some programming experience, but never programmed in Python, hadn't done anything with AI. And I had him write some code. I gave him a little spec, and it was basically the code was to dial into Edgar Online, pull down any new filings against a list of tickers. Uh, so a 10Q or a 10K, in other words, a
Yeah.
quarterly or annual filing, pull the prior filing, and then identify any significant differences between those two filings. And this 18-year-old built that system. He used the OpenAI API. I gave him $20 in API tokens. I'm not sure if he used half of that. He learned Python, um, and he probably spent about 30 hours on it, and he had a working system.
But
That's how powerful this stuff is, and how
at a
game
human
changing it
level,
is.
that's a very human story. And I remember on a panel discussion, I don't know, this is pre-COVID, so it must 7, 8 years ago. And it was somebody from Goldman Sachs was saying that people in market data used to be a spreadsheet jockeys. They had to know Excel, they, had to know pivot tables, all the inside out. But actually that was passé. And now really they needed to know how to code in Python. That was the new breed. You had to be able to code and understand Plateau or whatever, all sorts of new stuff.
Yeah,
But have we now sort of gone beyond that? So
beyond
now
that.
actually don't bother learning code because frankly, that's a waste
You
of
need I think
effort.
you still need the basics, but you know, um, most professional developers are using these AI based tools.
Yeah.
It just allows them, instead of coding in the past. Certainly when I did my first coding project at Rolls-Royce, was copying someone else's code and making it better.
Yeah.
That still goes on now. Actually, these systems are your buddy, and they are your co-pilot. They're helping you, and you can, because you can't remember how to do all of this stuff, and it will bring the code in. Typically you can run the code, and if it breaks, you debug it, but the process is massively accelerated. And you're right, for folks like us that might want to learn, relearn coding, it's a lot easier. And I think the impact that has on our industry, on market data, is that building new data sets, which in the past required you to have quite hard skills
Yeah.
and to be able to maybe have access to dozens of people that would be doing manual things and
Yeah.
extracting numbers from documents, that can all be done very quickly. So I think there are going to be challenger data sets that either were too expensive to build, or maybe the incumbents had hundreds of people doing this, so the barriers were just too high. I think the barriers to entry are going to drop, and I think you're going to see new data sets emerge quickly as well, based on mining of unstructured data, or maybe just kind of collecting and joining data together.
Tim, I'm so glad that we've discussed the entirety of AI and all the solutions and all the possibilities in 15 minutes. I mean, that it's done, isn't it? There's nothing else to
Yeah,
say. No, obviously, I mean, it's so
it's an
enormous.
exciting world, though. It's
Yeah,
it's moving.
there's
And look,
more.
what one of the reasons why my new business can be run as leanly as it is because we're using all of those tools. I don't see us hiring 100 people to curate and manage and connect data.
But another discussion would be an interesting one to understand if you're a big established player, how easy is it to change to that? You started out from the get-go, but if you've got legacy
Yeah.
processes, legacy people, I don't know. I mean, again, I haven't got an answer to that, but I bet that is a real issue, and it's an opportunity for small disruptors like you. I mean, that's
I
an
think you, I
a
think you
long.
have to, yeah, it's an interesting one. I think as a big firm, you have to equip all your people with those tools, but at some point, you kind of need to throw it away and start again, I think, because
And that's
um,
something big companies don't like doing.
I don't like doing.
It's legacy. I remember when I worked at Reuters, shutting down old systems. Reuters Monitor, I think, was supposed to be shut down
Yeah.
about 10 years, which was the old page-based system. Took forever because they just anyway. That's another discussion. So I
Yeah.
think we have not completed the AI discussion, but hopefully we've whet the appetite of people, and I will want to do, and I hope you'll come and help me on this podcast, do some deeper dives into that. But we've just sort of teed up some of the issues, not all of them, some of them. So so that's the end of our second section. Drum roll. I'm going to do one of my pauses, and then I will start talking after the pause. So here comes the
Should I
pause.
freeze my face?
That was the pause. So identifiers. Where do we start? I mean, security versus entity. I mean, ever since I've been aware of your active interest in this, and I've been trying to sort of understand it a bit more. A good friend of mine, Will Cowling, explained on our flight back from Frankfurt certain things to me. And then I was listening to the Waters Wavelength podcast, which I thought was very informative recently. And anybody listening to this, go and listen to that podcast as well.
Rebecca
Because
Nuttall.
they were going into a lot more detail. Little learning is a
They've
dangerous
done a
thing.
nice job following it, actually. The
Yeah,
whole.
I think this is a complicated area. So, I mean, Tim, I know you have some strong views about the rights and wrongs of some of these issues, but before we get into that, what on earth is? I mean, what are identifiers? What is the background story before getting into the more emotive?
Backstory.
Yeah,
Well,
what's the
so
backstory?
in their broadest term, an identifier might be a mnemonic or a number.
Is it the same as symbology? Is symbology
Yes.
identifies the
I thought yes. Um, so there are kind of human readable symbols. So let's take, and this can apply to lots of different things, like plants and animals. But obviously we live in the world of stocks. So a stock will have a ticker and it will have a MIC, which is the market that ticker trades in. So C.N is Citigroup and it trades on the New York Stock Exchange. I think that's what the N is. Could be NASDAQ. I think it's New York Stock Exchange. So you'll have a up to three letter MIC, and then you'll have a ticker, which I think is often four symbols. And they're human readable. And actually, the RIC, the Reuters Instrument
Yeah,
Code,
which we know
is
well.
the ticker with a dot and the MIC. And
Yes.
remarkably, the RIC is protected by copyright. Anyway, we'll come back to that. The problem with RICs and tickers is they change. So we mentioned on one of the earlier discussions the company Snowflake. So Snow, SNOW, is the ticker of Snowflake. Ironically, a few years before Snowflake was listed, there was a company that was a ski resort, and they were listed, and their ticker was Snow.
Right.
So the problem with a lot of the human readable tickers is they're not well managed, they're not immutable. In other words, they can they get reused, they're not stable. I think that's what immutable means. So very often what you need a number, you need something like a barcode, something that is unique and assigned to the Snowflake ticker and the one that trades on that market as opposed to the old one. Because quite often you might need to refer back to the price of the old one because you've got some, report to write to the regulator. And
And these
systems break because they reuse these tickers.
and
So
sorry, I just kicked my table. So these new identifiers, newish, are numeric. Is that or
yes,
alphanumeric?
yeah.
They're not
Well,
a
and
language.
they're not that new. So the CUSIP in the mid 90s, this is the history lesson. In the mid 60s, the New York Stock Exchange had to close on a Wednesday because they had so much paperwork because trading had hit, I think, 13 million a day. and they couldn't process all the bits. So they had these big share certificates, and they had to match buyers and sellers and paper tickets. So they got together a group of people and said, this can't continue. We need to modernize the industry. And this is obviously before computers, but there was a committee, which was the CUSIP committee, um, and they came up with this idea that we need a unique number for each security that trades, and
Right.
that became and that was named after the committee, the CUSIP. And I can't remember what CUSIP stands for, but the
This
C is
committee for some,
committee.
yeah.
Yes. And it was handed over to the American Bankers Association as the custodian, and life started getting better. And what was really clever was, because it was a numeric and a machine readable number, when computers came along, it enabled automation and has now become deeply embedded in how
So
markets
we're
work.
gonna come back to, well, actually, one thing I'd ask you as well. You just explain where the QSIP number sort of originated from, and the American Bankers Associate. We're going to come back to all of that.
Okay, right. Yeah, yeah.
How does this relate to an ISIN number? I should know what an ISIN stands for. Is it
So
international?
every country has a numbering agency, and in the US it's the CUSIP Global Service, right?
Yeah,
In in Germany, it will be a German-based numbering agency. I can't remember
yeah.
when. And so every country pretty much has their own numbering
I think
agency.
in the UK, London Stock Exchange Group does CDOL,
Yes,
SEDOL.
they'll do
I think the
CDOL.
Swiss does Valorans, and
Lawrence, that's right.
those are the
Yeah.
ones I'm familiar
So
with.
the ISIN is basically that underlying regional code plus a country code.
Right.
So if you take the QSIP for Tesla, and you add US on the front of it, and I think there's a check digit that makes sure that it's been done properly, that is the ISIN. And the ISIN is the global stand. That's what ties all these regional identifiers together.
Okay, so that's what the ISIN is, and
So
then
the
you,
ISIN
as you,
is the ISIN is basically the QSIP or the Valoran with just the country code added to it.
and in parallel to that, I mean, is things like the RIC code, does that still live on? Do
So the
people?
RIC still, so every ticker, so a lot of these codes are, you can't look at it and go, oh, that's Tesla. So that code needs to be semantically linked to metadata, and the metadata might be the exchange identifier, the MIC, and the ticker of the, and so that's basically where you start to get into this notion of a knowledge graph. So, and in order to be able to navigate across companies and securities and markets, you need to join all of these things together. So,
And And this unique identifier, funnily enough, it's going to come back to a pet topic of yours that I use on my training course, Rolls Royce. I
yes,
always use Rolls Royce as an example. Oh, we're talking about Rolls Royce, are we? Ah, hang on. Are we talking about Rolls Royce aero engines based in Derby or
yep,
Rolls Royce cars in Crewe? You know, they're different companies. There's no
yep.
link, I don't think, anymore between them. But if you just said the word Rolls Royce, you could get muddled. And your point about an unambiguous, absolutely unique identifier is what is
Well, so in
needed. So
that case, I suspect Rolls-Royce Motors as an entity still exists, and it will probably have an LEI, which is a
yeah,
which is a legal entity identifier, which has become somewhat of a standard. But you could also have the ADR for Rolls-Royce PLC that trades in the US, and that trades in dollars, and that will have a different.
different.
It will have a different ticker and MIC, but it will also have a different QSET or ISIN in that case.
So there's a very sensible and real reason why these things came into being, and at a technical level or whatever, they make sense. But I think, and I'm trying to give a segue into your concerns that you have
Mistake.
voiced, and others, not just you. You're sort of
Yeah.
is the fact that these have been created and then some sort of charging and licensing structure has been wrapped around them. I mean, again, little learning's a dangerous thing on my part. Where is the contention? Where is the argument? Where is the problem with
Yeah.
all of this?
So the first thing is these identifiers have become an absolutely essential part of what I consider market structure, the way that
As they should have
markets
done. I
work.
mean, they
Yeah.
should be essentially.
And it's
Yeah.
not just about clearing and settlement now, but it's also things like risk. What's my exposure to Rolls-Royce? Well, I own it. I own the ADR and I own the London Stock Exchange. So I need to add those together. So I need an entity master that links those precisely to those security. I also own the debt.
Yeah.
So being able to do that, the only way you can do that is to have a data model, and the data model needs to be fueled by these very stable, temporarily stable identifiers.
Right.
So because of that, these things are very valuable, right? Because without it's a little bit it's like any kind of regulated industry. You always have some material that is so fundamental to the way the industry works that if it's in the wrong hands, it can be abused. And I think what happened with the CUSIP was it was being operated by a commercial enterprise that was very rightfully looking at this CUSIP, this thing called a CUSIP that everyone had to have. And some creative people decided, let's come up with a way to sell more of it and require more and more people to actually pay a license for it. Now, I'm pretty sure that back in the 1960s, the idea of turning, what in every other country in the world is considered a non-profit making activity, the issuance, the Valoran team aren't making a lot of money minting Valorans, and they shouldn't. It's quite a simple thing. Generating a 8-digit or 10-digit number is not that hard. And it's typically done when a new issue is created. So, Rolls-Royce issues a new bond. In that process, a unique identifier is created. It's not like you're manufacturing, Tesla batteries. It's not a complex thing.
Let me. I'm deliberately going to avoid the hardcore contentiousness of this, but I mean, you and others like you, and some people have actually taken the current operators of CUSIP to court. So there's legal proceedings going on. The very simplistic, high level view is that, to use your words, that somehow the value is being abused in some way. That's at the heart of the argument. Can I ask you and that will be decided by judges
Yeah.
and what have you. And there's yeah.
And the Department of Justice, yeah.
But can I ask you a simplistic question within that? Is there, if you put that aside, is the CUSIP number and the US ISIN, is there anything wrong with it sort of structurally or, in terms of the way the numbers are created? I'll tell you why I asked that question, because I know there is an alternative that has been proposed, which is the FIGI, that was originated by Bloomberg, but since has been handed over to an open forum, so it's open source, it's not owned. But I mean, one of the things I've learnt about recently is the arguments against the FIGI and not so much pro the CUSIP is just all my systems are so embedded with the existing CUSIP to actually change would be horribly painful. I mean, that was very much the case with the RIC code. It was like, well, we got an alternative, something else, but
No one wants
how
another standard. No one wants
yeah.
to switch, and I totally get that. So a while ago, a few months ago, the federal it's called the Federal Data Transparency Act was passed. This was a couple of years ago, and part of that required the US government to implement better data standards. And this was a little bit like in markets. The goal was to improve transparency, right? So that you could quickly see who's dealing with who in government. And what happened was a working group, which I think spanned the SEC and the FDIC and the CFPB and all these acronyms all got together
All the
and,
regulators, yeah.
and all the regulators and pontificated on how they could, adopt a better set of standards around data. And out of that, remarkably, came the recommendation to use the FIGI instead of the CUSIP. And this was shocking to the industry, shocking to me, and a very interesting move. And it was partly because this federal act requires a high degree of openness. And by open, I mean freely accessible data. And the CUSIP, by definition, is very tightly licensed. If you touch a CUSIP, the CUSIP service will try and get you to sign a license. And as soon as you sign that license, you have to disclose whoever you send that CUSIP to, and they have to get a license. And that's not an open model. So they failed on that point.
So to this regulatory group, when they all got together, the federal whatever it was.
Yep. The FDTA.
Did they make that decision to go? And this is your opinion. I mean, you weren't necessarily involved in this, but do you believe they made that decision on the basis because they had been persuaded that the commercial arrangements that CUSIP were operating was problematic, or did they do a technical comparison between the CUSIP and the FIGI and say technically for whatever the FIGI was it a commercial based decision or a technical?
It was very much the first one, which was and they stated this in the write up, which was and they called out CUSIP, and it's what I call a licensing regime, but the closeness of the way the identifier is licensed, and they said that's the primary reason. Now, what they didn't do, and this is where they've come into for some criticism, is they didn't do an analysis of the cost to the industry to switch from one to the other, and it's probably measured in billions of dollars, because systems would remember at the end of 2000, everyone thought that
millennium,
that all the systems would blow up. Well, guess what? If they didn't do this, all the systems will blow up. And I know a number of big industry bodies have kind of, there was a whole comment period, and there were a lot of comment letters from very important, industry groups saying, look, this just doesn't work. So I think there's going to have to be a little bit of compromise, because the reality is, and probably some regulatory change. And as you said, there is also an antitrust lawsuit against the operators of the CUSIP for these practices. So I think actually the regulators in a bit of a tough spot.
Is that antitrust case? Because it sounds to me like until that's resolved, it's going to be hard to see a resolution or to understand how this is going to unfold. I mean, it's messy, complicated.
Well, the timetables aren't synchronized, unfortunately. So you've got the FDTA going on, and that's got a life of its own. And in theory, the comment period's closed, and the decision should be made in the next 1, 2, 3 months. I don't think it will, but that's the timetable they're working to. The legal process, I don't think the court case is going to occur until October next year, if it doesn't get settled out of court, which it may well do. So they're all they're all in a bit of a pickle, to be honest.
I know. And you, I think, as you are wont to do, commented on somebody's LinkedIn post, and I think it was from a UK bank. Had basically done a. This is what you do. This is what you have to.
This is how you stay safe. This is how you don't get the knock on the door.
I mean, here, putting aside all the rights and wrongs of this, what should people do? Is there, because in a sense, I think what that person was alluding to, and when I had a conversation with my good friend Will Cowling, who's a reasonable expert on this, it really getting to grips with understanding the CUSIP licensing and managing yourself and your organization in such a way to optimize slash minimize what you might pay is the short term to medium term
It's
approach.
a but the the reason why I commented on what was a very well written paper, which is how to manage and stay safe with this QSIP licensing regime, as I keep calling it. We shouldn't have to worry about that. That's a whole person's job. Her job is to worry about
But isn't
keeping
this a
everyone safe.
bit
It's a
like,
ticker. It's a factual. So that's the first
yeah,
thing. So my point there was think of the millions of hours that are
I
being
know.
spent generated by a regime which shouldn't even exist. Um,
But
and
isn't
so
that a little bit like when one used to rail to one's mother and say, it's not fair? I mean, and your
all right,
mother would say, life isn't fair. I mean,
but
I'm being highly
yeah,
simplistic, but there's
yeah,
a
but you
sort of,
know something. I think the if you talk to our friends in Switzerland or France or Singapore, and they have identifier systems which are
yeah,
completely open that are considered part of the way the market works. And then only in America has it been turned into a multi-hundred-million-dollar business
yeah.
that in turn, the cost of that, it has probably billions of dollars of expense or hundreds of millions of dollars just kind of managing around it. So it's fundamentally wrong. And people say to me, why are you so passionate about this? Well, when I joined that exchange, they had the CUSIP guys after them, and it ended up
Yeah.
costing a lot of money. And I can't go into any more detail, but I was disgusted with what happened there. It was entirely unfair and an overreach of a commercial organization that had been granted a mandate by the government.
And again, I've felt and heard your angst and anger. I've seen it on LinkedIn or on other things. So I'm very aware of it. But in looking ahead, I mean, antitrust is a horribly difficult thing for governments to get their heads around. Not least because the big players that they're supposed to be policing have such power, such much. Again, I'm going to get it slightly political if that's the right word. I'm very much a free market economist. That was the way I was broke up my degrees in economics. But as you get bigger and bigger entities on both sides, the supplier side and the customer side, I don't know, the market economics sort of breaks
Well,
down.
I think you need those checks and balances, and the Sherman Act, which is what this is being prosecuted through, it's in two parts. One is
Is that an
around
antitrust? Is the Sherman Act the
antitrust. So the
antitrust? Yeah.
Sherman Act is the antitrust, and the Department of Justice is taking a much firmer line. Well, let's see what happens after the change in government, but they're taking a pretty firm line now in a number of areas. This potentially included. So the Sherman Act's in two parts. The first part, I think it's the first part, is more about collusion, which is,
Yeah.
you know, companies getting together and fixing prices. And the other part is about using your market position, your dominant position to, to your advantage, by
And I think EU law,
raising prices.
yeah, the Treaty of Rome, I can't remember which sections had two, the collusion angle, and then also if you had market dominance, I think that was
But
another
but
issue.
what's interesting is back, I think it was 2013, the European antitrust, the European
Competitions, because
competition
it's more
authority.
competition law rather than antitrust is a very
That,
American phrase.
yes, so they legislated against the RIC and also against the CUSIP. So if you buy an ISIN in Europe, which is a US ISIN, you will
Yeah.
pay nothing for that. If you buy the CUSIP in America, you'll be subject to licensing. And that's because the regulators were tougher in Europe than they are here. But, maybe that will change.
Yeah, I mean, so when I mean, again, unfair question to ask you. I mean, when is all this gonna be sorted out? If you're a betting man, you don't know, but I mean, just you watch it very closely. So when do you think this will be resolved? One way or the other. It might not be resolved in the way you
I
want it to
think
be,
it
but
will. So, having watched this FDTA play out, what I would like is the regulators go, look, the industry said we can't switch, so we have to fix what we've got. We have to regulate. That puts the writing on the wall a little bit, I think. And I would expect then there to be some kind of settlement, a pre-trial settlement. If this goes to trial and the defendants lose, then the fines are tripled. So there's a very big, if you think you're going to lose, you're going to settle. And the way that they tend to settle these things is there's no admission of guilt, so no one goes to jail, right? Because
right.
Sherman Act, antitrust, people could go to jail theoretically. It probably won't happen. But so I think the stakes, with the passage of time, the stakes are getting higher. Now, your conspiracy theorists might say, well, we're going to have a change in regime and they're going to relax all this stuff that's big. But I think yesterday, Elon Musk said he was having a go at Microsoft for antitrust. So
there
you know,
could be. Watch this space. Look,
it's
Tim,
very interesting. So I hope that there's some sensible people. Unfortunately, things will have to change, and it will affect people's lives and jobs and things, but maybe not very much. It will probably more likely affect the bottom line of big corporations. And I think then we can all breathe a sigh of relief, and I can write about different things on LinkedIn. But as I say, this is such a fundamental part of how the data industry works.
I
Without identifiers, we wouldn't be able to do anything at all.
I remember from the RIC code, the Reuters instrument
Yeah.
code. I remember that as well. So look, watch this space. I'm
Yes.
sure, talk about this again. We will talk offline about it, but hopefully we'll talk online, on air again. So I think that doesn't conclude this section 3, but it concludes this discussion of that
Yes.
particular story that is going to run and run. So we've had our 3 topics. Just by way of conclusion, by way of wrapping up. I mean, big picture. I mean, I've hit you, or we've discussed 3 topics. What are the other big topics that you think need to be discussed? We're not going to discuss them now.
Yeah.
I want to whet the appetite of the audience. But what else is becoming really hot to discuss in the market
I don't
data?
know whether it's hot. I think generally the way that licensing of data happens is overly complicated.
Yeah.
And I'm going through this because I'm now, standing up a data
Yeah.
business, and we're touching exchange data, and in the process, it's just reminded me of the fact that for some reason we have data can be freely distributed if it's delayed 15 minutes. If the data is viewed by a human that's a non-professional, then it's treated differently to whether it's viewed by a professional.
I
If
know.
it's consumed by a machine versus displayed, it's different. And I understand the rationale for that, because it's about, squeezing every last dollar. But the cost of administering that, and
I think that is over the years, because I've been working with FISD. By the way, this podcast is not part of my FISD, I should add, but I still work closely with FISD, the Trade Association for Market Data, or when I explain FISD, it's the United Nations of the market, bringing everybody together to discuss all the issues. But that complexity, and I'll finish with an observation. I remember when my last job at Reuters was doing the pricing for RMDS. RMDS replaced Triarch and then was superseded by TREP and RDDS.
Yep.
And I remember sitting in a room in Palo Alto, and we said, let's talk about the pricing. Let's keep it simple. Our mantra should be to keep it simple. And X months later, I did a round the world tour. I wrote a 60-page document explaining internally the pricing. and it was a 2/3 hour presentation to the sales force. We had great intentions to be simple, but then every time, well, what about this situation? What about that situation? What, and it just got, so it was all well intentioned. The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yes.
So yeah, I think that is definitely a topic that we're going to talk about. So look, Tim, hopefully I can get you back for more of these. So don't get too busy in Blue Sky Nexus. Basically, if everybody listening just signs up and buys it, then you'll have plenty of time to talk to David Anderson. You won't have to worry about selling it. And I look forward to our offline chats, but hopefully we can have a few more online. So I'll have to go back and edit now those pauses that I created, and also this conclusion. Add some nice music as we fade away. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, David, for inviting me. And I'm sorry I couldn't have been the first. I know you had a couple of great guests before me, but
the third is the perfect one, really.
Yes, exactly. Yes, I didn't want to be the guinea pig. Anyway, super talking to you, and look forward to next time.
Okay, bye.
Bye bye.